for Russian leaders who actually weren't Russian. Some of the most influential and interesting people to rule over Russia and the Soviet Union in its long history were not Russian at all. Russia has existed as a political entity in some form for over 1,000 years. Most of its leaders during that time were Russians themselves. Whether due to instability in the Russian government or simply an accident of the countless ethnic groups annexed by Russia as it expanded, these four important leaders of Russia were not actually Russian. 1. Rurik. Though modern scholarship has drawn his historical status into question, Russian history typically begins with Rurik, the founder of the dynasty that ruled Russia for 800 years. But even though he ruled the first recognizable Russian nation in history, Rurik was not Russian himself. The story of Rurik was first described in the Primary Chronicle, a 12th century text detailing the earliest years of Russian history. At that time, the centers of power in Russia were not Moscow, but the modern cities of Veliki Novgorod in the north and Kiev, now the capital of Ukraine, in the south. So, rather than Russia, this early state is known as the Kievan Rus, and at its peak, it controlled large portions of modern Ukraine, Belarus, and western Russia. Around the year 860, however, these lands were controlled by a collection of Slavic tribes. Rurik did not come from any of these Slavic tribes to rule the state, which would grow into Kievan Rus, however. Whether he is a legend or a fully historical figure, the origins described in the Primary Chronicle are accepted to be an accurate description of the origin of the first Russian ruling dynasty. According to the Chronicle, Rurik was a Varangian, or in other words, a Viking explorer. Vikings had begun exploring, settling, and pillaging the Slavic lands in the 8th century, and engaged in both trade and war with the Byzantine Empire to the south. 2. Catherine I. Born a peasant named Marta Skowronska, Catherine was a Catholic Polish servant for most of her life. In her youth, Catherine lived a turbulent life outside Russia, exposed to countless different languages, religions, and cultures. Peter the Great was himself a lover of other cultures, and perhaps this fascination is part of what led to his eventual marriage to the illiterate servant-turned-empress. When a Russian general liberated her town from Swedish invaders, the pastor was identified as a useful translator, and he, along with Catherine, was brought to Moscow. There, Catherine eventually found herself employed in the household of Alexander Menshikov, a nobleman who also happened to be Peter the Great's best friend. She quickly got close with the Tsar, and they became lovers for several years until they were secretly married in 1707. Catherine converted to Orthodox Christianity and took the name Catherine around this time. She ruled alongside Peter when they were publicly married in 1712 until his death in 1725. After his death, Catherine managed to take the throne without much issue thanks to her long-time alliance with Alexander Menshikov, who helped her gain control of Russia after Peter died without naming a successor. Her rags-to-riches story is impressive, given the importance of social class in this period. Despite coming from a Polish Catholic background, Catherine importantly established a precedent that women could rule Russia, which helped prevent civil war in the coming years as the succession became more complex, allowing another Catherine to rule Russia. 3. Catherine the Great. Ruling Russia for over 35 years, Catherine II the Great was rightfully given the same nickname as her predecessor, Peter the Great. However, like the previous Catherine, Catherine the Great was not Russian and had to succeed a Russian emperor to make her way into power. When she did, however, she led the Russian Empire into a period of stability and made her nation into one of the world's great powers as the modern era began. Unlike Catherine I, Catherine the Great came from a powerful and respected noble family. But despite being known as a Russian empress, she was born a German princess, Princess Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst. Bankrolled by her relatives, Catherine traveled to Russia and met Peter III, the future emperor and grandson of Peter I and Catherine I. Their noble families schemed among themselves and eventually arranged their marriage in 1745. Her most notable advisor and lover was Gregory Potemkin, who helped her arrange a coup against her husband within 6 months of his coronation. His 6 months of ruling had seen numerous progressive reforms in addition to his German-centric foreign policy. Catherine's allies gladly helped arrest the emperor, who mysteriously died 8 days later, leaving Catherine, a German princess, as the sole empress of Russia. 4. Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin is perhaps Russia's most recognizable leader in a millennium of Russian history. What many do not know, however, is that Stalin was not actually Russian. How, then, did he end up ruling over tens of millions of Russians during the Great Depression, World War II, and the Cold War? Born Joseph Jugashvili, Stalin grew up in the city of Gori, which today is in the country of Georgia, then a province of the Russian Empire. An only child, his parents, Bessarion and Ketavan, were poor peasants. Bessarion worked as a shoemaker, but his business repeatedly failed, and he eventually became an alcoholic and abandoned his family. Lacking prospects otherwise, Stalin's schooling allowed him to follow his mother's dream for his future. Stalin was to become an Orthodox priest. Despite his propensity for violent crime with his gang and an attempt by his father to steal him away to work in a shoe factory, Stalin got through school and was accepted into the seminary in Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia. He excelled and was the top student in his classes. Throughout his 5 years at the seminary, however, he began to read prohibited Marxist literature. He was gradually drawn to the revolutionary cause sweeping the Russian Empire at the turn of the 20th century. Rather than finish his studies, he dropped out of the seminary to support the communist cause. Stalin quickly became a leader of Georgia's Committee of the Communist Party, and through his support behind Lenin's Bolshevik faction, which would eventually take over Russia and create the Soviet Union, it was at this point that he began using the last name we know today, Stalin. It was simply a pseudonym he used to publish articles in support of communism, and Lenin himself, meaning man of steel. Stalin supported Lenin by editing a newspaper and raising funds through organized crime, a callback to his youth as a gang member. As such, he was repeatedly arrested by the Russian Empire and was exiled to Siberia 3 times between 1900 and 1917, the year the Russian Revolution began. Returning from his exile to a totally new nation, Stalin joined Lenin and Trotsky in organizing the October Revolution, a coup that put Lenin in power. Having been one of Lenin's early supporters, Stalin was in a perfect position to push out other key Bolsheviks and, despite his Georgian roots, became the leader of the Russian-led Soviet Union and one of history's most brutal dictators.